Alright, so question 1. State the problem or conflict. So I guess the main problem seems to be talking about like the sensitivity of the subject of sexual abuse in a residential school. It doesn't seem inappropriate, I don't think, for interpreters to be talking to the doctor just about general things before the deaf patient arrives, especially if they're late. Let me look at my CPC though. You see, I guess what I first go to is number 2, professionalism, and specifically the 2.5, refrain from providing counsel, advice, or personal opinions. I guess what I'm unclear on about this one is whether or not the fact that the appointment hasn't started makes a difference, but it's, this is a difficult one. A little bit more looking at this. Approach consumers with a professional demeanor at all times. So I guess the issue then, I would say, is just even the discussion at all with this therapist shouldn't be going on, possibly, especially with that question. So I would probably state number 2, professionalism, just be like, so sorry, this is getting a little, I don't know. We'll look back. So I'll start thinking a little bit, what are the expectations of the deaf consumer? So the deaf consumer, I'm guessing, would probably not expect the interpreter to be discussing personal things with therapists before they arrive. I just got my panel result emails. I definitely have to check those out, sorry. Pass panel, that's a nice feeling. Okay, feels great. Back to this now. Okay. So the deaf consumer would be expecting you not to discuss things with the therapist, I would assume, ahead of time, even though that doesn't have directly to do with the deaf consumer or even like any directed individual. Kind of feel like that's sensitive information, especially in a mental health interpreting situation, that would maybe be a little intrusive or could lead the therapist to assume things about the deaf consumer coming in. Especially if this is the first time they're meeting. The hearing consumer probably has an expectation that you're like going to be on their side and give them extra information if they've never dealt with an interpreter before. It seems like a very common thing that people expect extra information about the deaf consumer or deaf culture. And deaf culture is good to inform people on, but this isn't exactly deaf culture. It's more of a societal issue. As the interpreter going into this, I'm expecting an interaction between the deaf consumer and the hearing consumer, not necessarily an interaction between me and the hearing consumer. So this is already a little off expectations by what I would plan, I guess, going into it. The agency involved. I feel like the agency expectation is that I stick with the professional code of conduct, and that if this goes against something, then I for sure should not violate it. So I think I'm going to stick with professionalism, number 2, the just refrain from providing advice or counsel or opinion. It's kind of a gray area exactly where this falls, but unless I maybe For sure at this point, I don't feel comfortable with my understanding of, I've heard about deaf residential schools and sexual assault and stuff like that, but I definitely don't have any kind of expert knowledge on that, so therefore I would maybe try and refer them to some other resources where they could look into that. So that's what I would do. I would refer them to some other resources where they could look into this possibly, or I would tell them to just talk to the deaf consumer about that. I would suppose that as a therapist, they probably talked to a client about sexual assault before, so it shouldn't be that difficult of a conversation for them to conduct. So the situational effects on all four groups. So when the deaf consumer shows up, if I've disclosed information about sexual assault in residential schools, I feel like that automatically puts them in a hot seat, and that could affect the rest of their their therapeutic relationship with this therapist. It could permanently change that relationship and therefore render all of this interpreting pretty useless. On the hearing consumer, if I were to give them information about, let's step back, the fact that I didn't tell the hearing consumer anything, another effect on the deaf consumer would just be maybe they can feel trust for me, or in general they don't have to be put on the hot seat immediately like that. The hearing consumer, if I don't tell them honestly what they have to do is their job, which the effect is that they're going to have to talk to the deaf person themselves if that's what they feel is part of why they're there for their counseling. So the effect would I be shifting the responsibility back onto the counselor or therapist to do their job. And situational effects on the agency. Oh, sorry, skipped interpreter. Situational effects on me could create some tension between the hearing consumer and I, possibly. They might feel that I was being rude, so I would definitely have to look into how I'd state that. I think I would really want to make sure to express that I don't have that knowledge and that I can refer to them to possibly other places where they could find out more. And on the agency, the short-term effect, the situational effect, I feel like there's basically next to none if I just follow the code of conduct and don't really disclose that information. And short-term and long-term effects in all four. So the deaf consumer ultimately could have a healthier relationship in therapy with their therapist if I'm not an extra interference, like a third party. I am a third party, but that's not exactly my goal in an interpretation. The hearing consumer long-term might look more into deaf residential schools and could quite possibly learn something, and therefore maybe become more apt to working with deaf clients in the future, or even specifically deaf clients suffering from sexual assault, even from residential schools. And the agency, short-term, long-term effects, again, not much as long as I do my job. The agency won't get involved in this to begin with. Okay, question number 2. All right, so question number 2. Okay, so I guess the problem is kind of multifold in this one. The fact that the deaf patient when they show up can immediately create a conflict of interest. But I guess if you didn't feel that that was too big of a conflict of interest at the time, that you could continue on with that session, and clearly the interpreter continues on with the session. The therapist approaches and in front of the deaf person asks if he can speak with you in private for a few minutes. Study the CPC a little. I suppose this brings me to number 4, respect for the consumers. Especially like 4.4, facilitate communication access and equality and support the full interaction and independence of the consumers. At that point, the interaction is done between the therapist and the deaf consumer, and there shouldn't be any need for me to be communicating with the therapist outside of an interaction with the deaf consumer. Okay, so yeah, I'd say number 4, just respect for consumer. What are the expectations for the deaf consumer? In their experience with interpreters, I would hope that they can expect that I would interpret that scenario to them, what was happening, what the therapist was asking of me, and then explain to both the deaf consumer and the therapist that I was only there for the interpreting interaction, and any personal questions or conversations the therapist wants to have with me really aren't appropriate while I'm on the job right there and then. The hearing consumer would probably expect me to, yet again, maybe just disclose information to them just because we're both hearing. Me as an interpreter, I would, going into that situation, expect that someone wouldn't put me there in that situation, but obviously that's going to happen. I suppose my expectations are that I remain faithful to the code of professional conduct and I don't disclose any information that might harm the interaction between the deaf and hearing consumer. My agency would definitely expect me to not engage in like a personal interaction like that when I'm on the job, especially if the deaf person is still like talking to the person at the front desk and trying to make an appointment. Clearly my responsibility right then and there is to be with that deaf person, facilitating that communication with the receptionist. So that would really be interfering with my job. It's not even like the assignment is completely over. I'm still working on the assignment with the deaf consumer, but the hearing consumer has unchanged at that point, I guess. And so the receptionist as a hearing consumer is expecting me to be there and help facilitate the interaction between her and the deaf consumer. Situational effects. Situational effects of the deaf consumer, they would probably be pretty offended. I would be. Maybe concerned about what the therapist wants to talk to me about. I would definitely be concerned if I was the deaf consumer in that situation. It does not seem appropriate that my interpreter would be having personal conversations with the therapist. Hearing consumer, again, might be put in a slightly awkward situational kind of area. I guess it could ultimately affect the deaf and hearing consumer's relationship. But overall, I can just tell them that if they have any questions about resources or continuing education, I guess is maybe not the right word, but something like that, that after I was done interpreting for the deaf consumer, that I could direct them to more resources, but I couldn't really have a private or personal conversation with them again, all the way back to professionalism. I guess this kind of has to do with both of those for sure. Short-term and long-term effects of the hearing consumer. Again, maybe they'll further their education on deaf culture at least a little bit. I think the biggest effect could be the relationship between the deaf and hearing consumer, that could breed some distrust if the deaf consumer is not filled in on that situation or is still unsure why the hearing consumer was wanting a personal conversation with me, the interpreter. Short and long-term effects as an interpreter would definitely just be, can't think if I'm thinking of interpersonal or intrapersonal like situation that you find yourself in for future interpreting between that deaf and hearing consumer. You might feel awkward or something like that. And the agency, as long as I continue to do my job correctly, if I might refer the doctor to the agency to find more resources possibly. I'm not sure if that's something agencies have. I would think that they maybe have some kind of way of finding more resources. Yeah, so I guess ultimately the agency might be involved, but if there was like a complaint filed against me or anything, I think I would be in the right. All right. Deaf person. Okay. Next question. All right, question number 3. So the problem is that I am one interpreter in a setting that would call for 2 interpreters. Especially, I can't remember way back at the beginning, but I think it maybe even said I was like a new freelance or an inexperienced freelance interpreter, in which case I definitely should not be taking on this assignment alone. Even as an experienced interpreter, I shouldn't go on a team assignment alone because, let me look at my CPC. Oh, also going back a little bit. No. Okay, request support. Number 2, professionalism. That I don't think it would be appropriate to continue that situation. It's not a professional manner, and also respect to colleagues in the future. The agency might assume that that was something that was okay when it clearly wasn't. So I would say that that's a situation where you need a team, and that's something you would have to make someone aware of. So, excuse me, sorry. What are the expectations of the deaf consumer? They're going into this event, both the deaf and hearing consumer are going to expect me to be able to facilitate the conversation and interaction and fully provide access to language for both parties. So, and my expectation with that, I am going to be in a situation that will not be too overwhelming for me to handle as an interpreter, and that I will be able to render the message faithfully. The agency is expecting me to show up to my job and render the message as faithfully as possible while working with the appropriate number of team members. What would you do? I suppose since it's the first session of this ongoing group, that I would maybe let them know that for this week it was not going to work out because we could not have the appropriate number of interpreters to facilitate the conversation, and that I would definitely, with such sensitive information, I would feel uncomfortable going into that situation and not being able to fully communicate with the deaf consumer what was going on. they would have every right to know everything being said in that group session. The point of being in group is to be around other people, I guess, and so that would kind of be defeating the whole purpose of the group therapy. So since it's the first session, I would probably be like, let's do this next time when we actually have a team member. Situational effects. The deaf consumer might initially be disappointed. They might be pretty upset. It's possible, I suppose, if they were really relying on this group, but ultimately it's better to not put them in a situation where they don't have equal access to language, and I could be held accountable for that. The hearing consumer might be disappointed, but ultimately will be able to carry on with that group. I don't think it should make a difference if there's 12 or 11 members in the group, really. Me as the interpreter, I would not lose any money, I think. Maybe have some free time, but not have the assignment, so not have that experience. The agency would definitely be under a little bit of stress and could possibly suffer from a complaint from the hearing or deaf consumer because they were unable to send in the appropriate numbers of interpreters. Short and long-term effects for the deaf and hearing consumer, or the deaf consumer could have maybe missed something in that particular group session that would be referenced in the future or something, but since this is an ongoing group therapy with kind of moving members, it looks like, I don't think that would ultimately make a huge difference because that's kind of the situation that they're being put into. The hearing consumer, long and short term, is in a similar boat. I suppose the hearing consumer suddenly becomes everyone in that room who is hearing, but it doesn't make a huge difference on the hearing consumer whether or not that deaf person can attend one ongoing group therapy session or not. Me as the interpreter, I would feel good about that choice long term. I don't see any reason why I should be punished for it of any sort. The agency would not expect me to continue on in that manner. In the long and short term of the agency, they just might start looking into better ways to find replacements for people or something like that. All right, question number 4. Interesting. So I suppose the problem is that I no longer feel equipped for this situation. This could pull in quite a few different tenets, I suppose. Okay, so conduct number 3, specifically 3.2, decline assignments or withdraw from the interpreting profession when not competent due with physical, mental, or emotional factors. So emotionally and mentally, you would not be prepared to continue on with that assignment. So what are the expectations of the deaf consumer? They would probably assume that the same interpreter was going to continue showing up for their ongoing assignment. The hearing consumer would probably have a similar expectation. My expectation as an interpreter is that I'm able to keep my mental health, and so I know that going into these situations might be difficult, but it still is important to do self-care. And the agency would expect me to do my job, but also know that if I was unable to continue, it would be unethical to do so, and therefore it is their job to find it is their job to find another interpreter to take over that position. It wouldn't be the first time that happened. So what I would do is I think I would tell the agency that I no longer fit for that job, that even if need be I could possibly do the next week's session, because it doesn't really seem like me saying like, oh, I'm really not looking forward to this isn't quite as bad as like I cannot do this. And so the expectation, okay, yeah, I did that, sorry. So I would tell the agency, situational effects on the deaf and hearing consumer. It would put them possibly at a disadvantage if no one was able to show up the next week, or more so they might be concerned, like the deaf consumer might be concerned about some confidentiality or how this information was passed along to the new consumer or the new interpreter, and I'm sure the hearing consumer would have similar concerns, like what does the new interpreter know? Are we going to have to backtrack and go over things and such? Situational effect of me short term, it might put me under pressure to do another session if need be, and which could have an emotional effect on me. But ultimately, that's next. So having to do another session could make me feel negative, and it also, that's the next thing I want to say too, sorry. Situational effects for the agency is they would have to scramble and find someone new, but I'm assuming that within a week they might be able to find someone. Short-term and long-term effects for the deaf consumer and the hearing consumer, again, I think would just be like concerns about confidentiality, and kind of the flow of how the communication has been going. If it's been good with me as an interpreter, there might be concern that could change with the future interpreter. Me, short-term, long-term, I might evaluate my ability to work in the mental health profession a little bit, or at least in cases in regards to like sexual assault, I might consider not doing those assignments in the future. And on the agency, short and long-term, just finding another interpreter, I suppose, again. All right, question number 5. So the problem is there's someone you recognize with a group of young boys who have had explicit sexual fantasies about young boys, and you know this from the interpreting situation. So there's suddenly a conflict there. This one definitely could touch on a couple different tenets. So I would say possibly that maybe the one that I would think most has to do with this is conduct, avoid performing avoid actually perceived conflicts of interest that might cause harm or interfere with the effectiveness of the interpreting. I'd say that because my opinion of the man, therefore, in that situation and in communicating with the boys might make me or influence me to want to change the way I'm interpreting something. So the expectations of the deaf consumer and the hearing consumers there is that I'm going to interpret for them and be there like I agreed to. The expectation for me as the interpreter would be going into this assignment that I would be in a comfortable situation around Boy Scouts on a kind of a long assignment. And the agency, since I'm doing this pro bono, I guess there's no agency involved, I think. What would I do? I think I would continue on in that assignment just because you agreed to that situation, and it seems like it would put the deaf boys at quite a disadvantage if you backed out. That leads to situational effects. If I were to back out, the deaf boys could lose some quality bonding time. The hearing consumer who asked me to go might be very disappointed. The hearing consumer who could possibly recognize me as the interpreter in the situation might also become frustrated. That could lead to completely other problems. And me and the interpreter as a situation, as long as I didn't feel physically unsafe, I suppose, it would be okay. It would maybe be uncomfortable, but there's times when you have to work through situations that aren't ideal. Agency wouldn't be involved again. Short and long-term effects of the deaf consumer, kind of just, again, the boys bonding and their overall experience with the Boy Scouts Club. The hearing consumer, short and long-term effects. I suppose that hearing consumer that initially asked me to come and participate with this would maybe like want me to come back again in the future, so I would have to consider that. An interpreter, long and short term. Just the overall impact of being around them that weekend. I definitely couldn't say anything to anyone about that, which would be frustrating. I would for sure have to find a way to debrief with like my team or like other interpreters of some way, because that would be a very I'd feel like I was holding something heavy if I was in that situation. I'm taking a long time, so I think we're going to go to the next question. I guess the problem then is my conflict of interest again, is that I know that this father has had some sexual fantasies about young boys, and I might be considering what he would do in this particular situation with these young boys. This again would have to do with kind of the same CPC like conduct and confidentiality, I suppose, too, for sure. Yeah, I guess that one's kind of sort of confidentiality. Expectations of the deaf consumer, that I participate in the assignment like I said I would. Expectations of the hearing consumer. My friend would expect me to be there, and the hearing father, who I recognized from therapy, would also expect confidentiality. My expectations would be that I'll adhere to the code of professional conduct, and the agency is still not really involved. What I would do, I think because I already decided in the last question that I would continue on with this assignment, I think I would continue on with this assignment, hold that information in the back of my head, but there's no need to like tell everyone this father has dreams about sexually assaulting young boys because he was sexually assaulted as a young boy. That doesn't mean he's going to do these things. It doesn't seem like if he was a harm to society, he probably wouldn't be just in an outpatient kind of setting anyways. So I would continue on. Situational effects for the deaf and hearing consumers would just both be that I can help continue to facilitate their weekend and their conversations. For the interpreter, it could put me in might be conflicting to me still as I continue the assignment, and I might also be maybe paying more attention to the way that father was communicating with the boys and what he was saying. But ultimately, it shouldn't change the way I act. Agency still not super involved. The long and short-term effects on the deaf consumer and the hearing consumer. I suppose, like, the deaf consumers, these boys really wouldn't know much. I mean, okay, so potentially if something bad happened, a long-term effect on the deaf consumer boys could be some trauma. The hearing consumer, the father could be mad at me, I suppose, if I had not disclosed some information like that. And me as the interpreter, I would probably, having that knowledge in the back of my mind might continue to bother me, like even weeks or months after this interpreting, I might be like, oh my god, remember that one guy who is probably still interacting with this Boy Scouts group. Last question. Okay. Nothing left to do. All right, thanks.